Hey, guess what, everybody? Go listen to the Break It Down show.
And now, the Break It Down show with John and Pete.
Mike Waltz, hey, first off, thank you very much for coming on the show. I appreciate it. I read your book. Your book, in particular for me, gives me a lot of things to reflect upon because we have very similar experiences and frustrations. We may not agree on a lot of things. And when I say that, I mean, 80-20.
Right. You
are absolutely on the money with what I've directly experienced. In particular, one of the things that stood out to me was you're talking, I saw an interview with you when we did some show prep. I'm talking about how the higher command is trying to prevent bases from being overrun and yet also protect elements when they're outside of the wire. And that, in effect, cripples teams so that they can't perform their task, which makes nation building, which is really what we're trying to do, it makes nation building impossible.
Yeah, no, it's something that it really underscored a lot of our effort there in 2 points. One, to put it in the broader perspective, there's a lot of debate about, and has been over the years, about numbers of troops and troops on the ground and boots on the ground and whether we commit or we don't. And those are obviously critically important strategic decisions. The points that I tried to make were that we also needed to use the troops that we do have on the ground a lot more effectively. And point one. And then point two was that, we became, I don't want to say obsessed, but there was just an overemphasis and an overfocus on force protection and on kind of a zero defect, zero casualty mentality. And when I questioned it out on the ground, the response constantly was, well, the American populace, really can't be able to absorb additional casualties coming home from this war, so therefore we need to take these extraordinary measures to prevent any losses. And kind of my counterpoint was, we can't protect the populace we don't allow ourselves to access. So if we're behind these overly fortified bases, if we're riding around in 20-ton armored, mine-resistant vehicles, and we're trying to kind of prevent the loss rather than playing to win, we're really working against ourselves in a counterinsurgency environment.
That's a great point, because I didn't experience the things that you guys did, so I approach it just from the standpoint of wanting to be an informed voter. Mm-hmm. And the problem, I think, exists in that the decisions are made to minimize the perception that we're going to suffer casualties. And there's a lack of a counter voice that says, ultimately, the most important thing we have to do is be effective and win over the people and make it so that we can all work together. And that doesn't translate. I mean, it's really like when someone's running for office and they say, I've put all these people in jail, I'm tough on crime. Well, that's great, but your community's still in a shambles because your kids aren't being educated and you're not fostering an environment of success.
Oh, right. And the point that I've tried to make in the book and that I'm continuing to make through media engagements like this one is that the more armor that we strap around ourselves and the more barriers we put between us and the populace that we're trying to engage, actually the less safe that we are. And that the more casualties we end up taking in the long run by being disconnected from the underlying causes of stability and, frankly, by making ourselves kind of ignorant about what's really going on out in the countryside. You can't possibly build relationships in a part of the world where relationships are absolutely critical when when you have helmets and body armor and armored vehicles and you only commute out to the villages where the violence is taking place and then go back to your base. It's just not a recipe for success. Yet I saw in my time out on the ground that, in multiple tours over a period of 10 years, more and more and more emphasis on using technology as the solution rather than engaging with the populace.
That technological advantage that we have, it is important, and it's important to leverage it. And I think you and I both agree, things like drones, all the different kinds, especially the handheld, like the Raven, is great for a maneuver unit. But what we have to do is share that with our partnered country. I'll give you an example real quick. So there's an ability to have, this is for our listeners, there's ability to have a static blimp in the air that can see with really good clarity what's going on in an area and kind of just overwatching everything. And instead of sharing that with the community leaders to let them see what it is and with the police and use that to create a sense of security, which I think, Michael, you'll agree, security is probably the first, second, and third priorities for these people. We hide that. We hide that information, and so it becomes mysterious and dangerous. And I've even heard villagers say that thing has an X-ray camera to look at our women, which is only, so now we've taken our technology, which we think is helping us, and we've made it a huge disadvantage if we even bother to be aware that it's a disadvantage, which we typically don't.
Well, and I'll just add to that with kind of two stories on how technology can be, obviously it can be a huge advantage, but then we can become over-reliant to the point where it's a disadvantage. The aerostats that you're referring to, which are essentially blimps on a cable, that have just a fantastic ability with the cameras on them to see miles and miles and miles around a base, were fantastic. But, I worked with one coalition partner who became so dependent on this thing to understand what was going on that when the weather was bad and the aerostat had to be pulled down, they didn't allow anyone to leave the base. So essentially every time in a part of the world with horrible weather, particularly through the winter, that lack of technology then became a crutch. And they didn't conduct operations when it wasn't available. To your point on drones, another kind of similar story. One time we were going through, my special forces team, we're going through a pretty notorious pass where there were a number of ambushes or often IEDs. I mean, one thing about the Taliban is they were hitting us in the same place that they had hit the Russians and that they had hit, our probably Alexander the Great before them. So we knew it was a dangerous area, but it was on the way to a village that was very eager to work with us, and it was very eager to receive some development projects. Well, I passed, a number of Humvees that were stopped before we got through the dangerous part, and I stopped and talked to the lieutenant, the infantry lieutenant, who was bringing some development advisors to come meet the elders of this village, and he was stopped and had been sitting there for hours, and I asked him why. And he said, well, we're no longer allowed to go through that pass until a Predator drone scans it ahead of us. And we don't have enough drones, so we've been sitting here for hours waiting on this drone to become available so that it can make sure the pass is safe for us. And I said, look, I asked my interpreter to call his cousin down in the village, ride a motorcycle through the pass, make sure it was okay. Everything was fine. We went down to the village, and turns out the elders were hugely offended because we weren't trusting enough of their kind of invitation to come and see them. So, I mean, sorry, that was kind of a bit of a long story, but it's another example of how we become overly dependent on intelligence on technology rather than using common sense.
No, Michael, it's a great story, and the length isn't really important. What's important is the lesson, because I can amplify that lesson myself over and over and over again, where we have these great intentions, but we lose, and you and I both agree on this, we lose the information battle every day, all the time, constantly getting our butts handed to us. And we lose it so bad, we can't even see or hear that we're losing it. We're just getting devastated. So here we are sending a clear message. We don't trust you elders to protect us through this pass. So instead of using a cultural approach where you say, hey, you guys have to make sure that we're safe, and vouchsafing their passage through that area.
And we trust you to do that. Now you're allowing their culture to be powerful, instead of dumbing it down, smashing it down, and imposing will. And those are the smooth kind of wins that you can do. And, put yourself at risk, but also put yourself, in a possible situation where you might have some success.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so, time and time again, I mean, we can go on and on. One of the chapters in the book talks about an insurgent commander that came into a village and was threatening a series of elders that had developed a good relationship with. Their sons and families worked with us, worked on the base. I mean, they worked with the Afghan government. And, one of the elders called and said, please come get this man. He is going to kill me and my family. He's forcibly recruiting young men to come fight with him. He's forcing everyone to provide money and he was a commander with the Haqqani network, who's affiliated with the Taliban. And by the time we went through the 12 approvals necessary to conduct an offensive mission. And by the time we had Predator drones available to scan ahead of the attack helicopters that had to be available to scan ahead of the troop-carrying helicopters, the commander had done his damage, he was long gone, and we lost the support of that village. So again, I try to make the point that inaction and over-reliance on force protection and over-caution can have just as damaging consequences.
Yeah, that's crystal clear. If not more so, multiplied more. You can show up and you'll get a sufficing kind of behavior from villagers. It does not mean that they're on board with what you're doing. They're just enduring your presence as much as they're enduring the Taliban presence. And then the other thing I would add too is we talk in terms of counterinsurgency, and the military struggles with that term. They're not sure what to make of it. A lot of people are very angry. We even took that approach because they wanted us to go smash the enemy, which is what a military is supposed to do. But the reality is we don't fight those kind of wars. I mean, the last symmetrical warfare has been decades, and we do fight these little, small, low intensity conflict wars. And we can call it a counterinsurgency in Afghanistan, but really the Taliban was the legitimate government. We are the insurgents. We are the ones that come in and try to change what's normal. We're not that good at doing that yet.
Well, you hit on a couple of points there. One, there's this notion that these folks will never change. We're not going to change them. We really can't make a difference. We've been there 13 years, and we just need to bring the boys home. And that you hear that from both the far right and the left, and frankly, in so many words, that's essentially the current administration's policy is to end the war and at least end the war for the United States, and to go down to 0 troops by the end of 2016. I think that's an incredibly dangerous policy for a number of reasons. One, I think we need to start wrapping our minds around, and I'd ask your viewers to be open to the fact that yes, we're 13 years into this. But I would argue that we're 13 years into a multi-decade, multi-generational effort, and we need to begin thinking about it in the same way that we thought about combating the ideologies of communism and of fascism, and just as we're now fighting the ideology of Islamic extremism. It is going to take a long time. It's easy to blow up a tank or bomb a building. It's incredibly difficult to defeat an idea. And just as it took us decades to defeat the idea of communism in South Korea, in Germany, in Western Europe, in Japan, and other places, we need to begin thinking about how we sustain long-term engagement. Because we've seen now, sadly, the results of just pulling out and turning our backs like we did in Iraq, and I fear that we're heading down the same road in Afghanistan.
That was a few great points. Actually, we've heard from Navy SEALs who have said on our show previously, specifically Duke Harbin. He said two things: we cannot maintain the operational tempo that's being asked of our fighting forces right now. We just can't. But the counter to that was we also cannot afford to pull out and make everything that we've done the last 13 years completely ineffective, because it is multi-generational. To defeat an ideal, it's no difference than gang violence in Los Angeles. Right. When guys are raised with a certain set of principles to which they're inculcated by their fathers and uncles, and then their fathers and uncles die and leave them behind with just the message that they need to keep fighting. And this cultural change takes a long time, and it takes a lot of goodwill.
Yeah, it does. And I dispute the notion. My brothers in Naval Special Forces and the SEALs, they have a bit of a different mission. I mean, they are wonderful and extremely talented at breaking things and at finding and fixing and killing our enemies. They're some of the best in the world. Army Special Forces are a bit different. We learn the culture, we learn languages as part of our training, and we really focus on embedding with indigenous populations, whether it's tribes, local police forces, or their military, and being able to take 3 or 4 Army Green Berets, Army Special Forces, and train and mentor 4, 5, 600 of their military or tribal forces. So, if you look at examples like what we've done in Colombia with the Colombian army against the FARC, what we've done in the Philippines against Abu Sayyaf, what we did in the 80s and in El Salvador and Nicaragua, there are ways to approach these problems with relatively little cost. We're not talking divisions on the ground for decades and decades, although we have done that in West Germany and South Korea. We still have 30,000 soldiers in South Korea. But there are ways to do it that's sustainable over the long term, but we have to begin taking that approach when we're telling the region, we're telling our enemies, and we're telling the government, and we're telling our partners, and we're telling the populace who's making life or death decisions every 2 years that we're leaving. Well, I don't think we're going to get the results that we want. I mean, they are betting their lives on our sustained engagement and presence and protection. And when they're constantly hearing we're leaving, and the insurgents are constantly telling them, hey, you better make a decision, the Americans are going to abandon you and we'll still be here, then we find everyone hedging against us rather than working with us.
Especially when we make that statement true. And I
That's
think,
right.
if I may interpret Duke's comment, what he meant by that was that the SEALs go in and they do what they're tasked to do. And to make any sustainable difference, we need to stay behind. And it's the same point. And even though he was saying that their guys can't continue to do this endlessly, the point that I heard from him was that as we work together, our mission needs to be completed for whatever they've done in the beginning of it to be effective in the long term. He also said that, Pete, help me out here. I think that when we pulled out of Iraq, he heard that everything was back to the day before we arrived in a period of 11 days or something.
Yeah, it didn't take long at all. And that's true. And part of what Duke was talking about is the pace of combat of door kicking, going out in the evenings and night times, doing night raids, pulling people in, rinse and repeat, doing that over and over and over again. Do that for 6 months, come back to your family, relax, go on vacation, train up, go back, 6 month tour, kick indoors, go grab bad guys. Now within that bad guy mission also, and Michael, you know about this, the catch and release nature of what we do. Go find a bad guy,
Right.
Put a target package together on him, arrest him, and then 2 weeks later, by law, he's released because there's no case, because there's no witnesses, because our rule of law isn't their rule of law. That's part of that PTSD piece, that betrayal of why am I doing this? Why am I going into these extremely dangerous situations? Why am I causing the populace to go crazy and have a rage against us only to have a guy released 10 days later?
If you like the show,
And you know you do.
send us some pictures of your movies.
Don't do that. Support the show.
There are 3 ways you can support us.
Number 1, go to iTunes or Stitcher or wherever you listen to podcasts.
And leave a 5-star rating and review.
It helps with the show metrics and helps us get better placement. Number 2,
Visit our website.
www.breakitdownshow.com.
We've got an Amazon and an eBay link.
Same Amazon, same eBay, you know and love, but they give us a little kickback when you get to their site from ours. And number 3, leave comments about the shows that you like. We want to know what you think, how you feel.
Tell us how to make the show better. We greatly appreciate it.
Now back to the show.
We like boobies.
Listen, I couldn't agree more, and that is it's not sustainable strategically, and it's not sustainable at kind of a human level for the SEALs or Green Berets or anyone else. Direct action and those types of missions are a component and need to be a component of a broader strategy. That involves training their military to be able to do those types of missions, which we are doing, but takes time. It involves much broader efforts like education, like women's education, and really to begin targeting in a positive sense, that next generation, and to begin changing their minds. I mean, oftentimes these jihadi fighters, we've lost them. They need to go and they need to die. But it's that next generation that we need to begin reaching out to understand really the positive aspects of American engagement. One of the other things I write about in the book was my time embedded with special forces from the United Arab Emirates, the country that is most famous for Dubai and Abu Dhabi and being a wonderful moderate Arab ally. And going out into Afghan villages and to have an Arab officer standing next to an Afghan officer and standing next to an American officer, and for the Arabs to say, look at what the United States did for Germany, look what they did for Japan, look at the positive things that America has done in the world, and then to also have that Arab officer begin undermining this perverted ideology that Islamic extremists are pushing around the world was incredibly important. So, again, long-winded response, but the types of missions that the SEALs are doing, they're right, are not sustainable. They have to be part of a broader strategy. What this administration has done is, I think, over-relied on drones and direct action to just kind of beat the leadership back and have not engaged in these broader efforts. In fact, they've turned a lot of them off in both Afghanistan and Iraq, and now we're seeing Yemen crumble. We're seeing Libya crumble. They've got to begin taking a more holistic approach than just what the SEALs were doing.
Yeah, you're right about that. The holistic approach is important. And you've said a lot of very important things in that statement. So the length isn't a problem.
I also want to just make sure to give you the opportunity that we cover anything specific that you want to cover before we plug anything that you think our audience should run and see, or any appearances that you're making coming up.
No, I mean, I would appreciate two things. One, obviously, a mention of the book, Warrior Diplomat. But what's important to me is for your audience to know that I'm giving all of the profits from book sales to charity, specifically to the Green Beret Foundation and to the Matthew Pacino Foundation. So, Staff Sergeant Matt Pacino is one of the soldiers that I lost in Host in my last tour. So, and that's something that's important to me for your viewers to know. And frankly, it's something that I hope future authors that have done time downrange or in this war on terrorism begin to emulate. I think we need to give back to the guys that didn't make it back and don't have the ability to write books.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to do two things along those lines. Naturally, we're going to keep your mention of the stuff in the show. Absolutely. And thanks for bringing those things up. But we're also going to put banners on our front page for the Green Beret Foundation and the Matthew Pacino Foundation. And we'll have links on our show page, not only so that folks can listen to our show, but go directly to Amazon and buy the book.
Yeah, and this is one of the things we try to do for our listeners is give them an idea that everybody wants to support, they all want to thank, but if you want to really help the damaged families, the damaged people that come back, they could use your help, and a few dollars here and there really goes a long way. So
it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does, and it's the least we can do, frankly.
So you have the unique approach of being a high-level guy. You've also worked at the Pentagon, and you've been on the ground. I have a similar experience where I would reach all the way up to division a lot of times, but the things that I would see on the ground, and on the ground, it's just patently clear that what the good idea, the beautiful idea at the strategic or theoretic level, number one, isn't reinforced with training. We don't train how we fight. And I'm really big on that. But also, it's not possible in that valley. Every valley in Afghanistan is different. And you talked about female education, which is very important. So my real quick story about that is we had an Afghan governor who was very good. He was trying to help out. Even though his card said he was a bad guy and tied to the Taliban, you give the guy a chance, let him have authority, let him handle things. One, he's going to bring religion in to solve his problem, which makes us uncomfortable. And two, he's going to talk about the importance of female education. And he'll tell you it's his number one priority. And then as he lays out his action plan to achieve his number one priority, he talks about security in three different aspects. The individual male family leader's protection, that he can go out and do the things he needs to do. And while he's gone, his family is safe. And while his kids project out to school, that they're safe. And if you can't meet those three requirements, there is no female education. The next level was you have to have male education because the males run our society right now. And we can't empower our females if I can't get my son educated It just can't work here. It has to be this way first. And until we can accept that reality, and I'm not saying that it's the right reality, but it's their reality. And until we can accept it and work within their paradigm, we can't, because all too often we come up with this great idea. We're going to make the school for girls, and all we do is get girls targeted. I mean, we'd have female engagement teams that would go out, and the one requirement to be on a female engagement team was to be female. There was no specific training. There was no command emphasis on it. It was something that had to be done. And so it would be done, but there was no idea what happened. 5 minutes after you left that village, what happened to those females? No one could answer that question. And so you and I both know what that means. That means you're not doing any good. You're harming things.
Sure. Yeah, no, I mean, so a couple of points that I'd address there. And one is I absolutely agree with you. There has to be a sequence to get to the goal of female education, and it has to be within cultural norms, or it just won't happen. And the first of those, as you mentioned, was security. And to tie it back to my previous points, security is directly tied to commitment on our part and commitment on the Afghan government's part. And I'll just tell you a quick anecdote. One of the elders that I built a relationship with was from the Mangal tribe, which was one of the dominant tribes in eastern Afghanistan, and his name was Ghafurzai. I spent the better part of a year developing a relationship with the Ghafurzai primarily because he had over 1,500 tribal militia that were frankly better armed and equipped than the Afghan army that we were working with. And I wanted them working with us, and he wanted to work with us, but it took time to develop that relationship. I was going to see him in December of 2009 to kind of, cement his commitment to have his tribal militia working with the Afghan government, working with the coalition. Well, as I was going to see him, President Obama announced in his West Point speech, he announced the surge, but then in the same speech, he announced the withdrawal of the surge. And I was just, frankly, stunned. One of my officers standing next to me watching the speech said, that's like Franklin Delano Roosevelt announcing D-Day, but then telling the Germans we'll be gone in 6 months. Right. So, and I immediately saw this play out on the ground. A week later, when I go to see Ghafurzai for the final commitment of his militia, he gave me a very cold reception, didn't even offer tea. And when I finally got to the bottom of it, he said, look, we always suspected it. We were always nervous about it. But now your president has said it. You're going to abandon us. You are not going to stand with us. And I tried to explain, no, it was just the surge forces and the nuance, but they didn't hear that. What they heard was America was leaving. As I kind of got up to walk away, just completely dejected and disappointed, he said, look, here's one thing you need to take back to Washington. Until America is prepared to commit its grandchildren to stand shoulder to shoulder with my grandchildren, we can't work with you, and this won't work. Because the Haqqani network, the Taliban, will have a gun to my family's head tonight when you leave. So you're absolutely right. In order to be able to achieve those broader, long-term kind of objectives like health and women's education and other things that are going to get these unstable places to a better place, we have to provide a kind of a modicum of security. In order to do that, they need to believe that we're going to stand with them.
Yeah, you're right. And there's the truth hitting you right in the face when that guy who was responsible for thousands of lives says, I cannot work with you because I will be at risk. My people will be at risk. That is it right there. That is the cold, hard truth. And we fail to hear that. And you brought up another very important thing too, is there's a perception that people don't like America in the world. And yes, there are people that don't like us, but by and large, sure, the people that I've met have very high expectations of us. They know that we're honest, that we'll do what we say. Yeah, we're big and bombastic and over the top. They've all said that, but they love that we're there. They love that we're the one country in the world that will come and try to help. We just got to get better at helping these folks and managing expectations. We'll show up and we'll come in and try to save the world. I had Iraqis tell me all the time, you guys have spent billions of dollars. I don't have electricity. You guys brought fresh water here, but there's no sewer. Now we have a sewage problem. What are you guys doing? You're America. You're better than this. And so it's not that they don't like us. They expect a lot from us, and leaving is not what they expect. It's not what they want.
Yeah, sure. I mean, absolutely, and I've experienced the same thing in a number of places. In Afghanistan, in particular, when they saw a coalition of 42 of the wealthiest nations in the world coming, but yet 5 years, 6 years, 8 years later, their lives hadn't improved, and at the same time, they're being threatened on a daily basis by local insurgents who are in their villages at night while we're back, behind our fortified bases. It creates a recipe for us to have not made the progress we should have 13 years on. You're right. I think part of that, again, to put my kind of strategic hat on, is that we're not organized effectively as a government to conduct this type of warfare. And what I mean by that is our authorities and our expertise are often with our civilian agencies, but our ability to really operate in difficult, unstable, or combat environments with the military. And so, for example, we had a real problem in a number of these places with border control. Well, the Department of Homeland Security or our border agency isn't exactly prepared to deploy border agents who understand tariffs and crossings and how things really should operate. So you end up finding second lieutenants in the 82nd Airborne trying to run cities or manage borders or train police on the rule of law and do things that civilians have the expertise to do. And the middle ground then that we often find is contractors. And that has a lot of positives but a lot of negatives as well. So, I've argued back here in Washington for almost kind of a Goldwater-Nichols type reform of our interagency. The Goldwater-Nichols Act was the one that made the Army, Navy, and Air Force kind of all work together in a joint environment back in the 80s. And I'd say we need that same type of reform now on our interagency.
We try to do that now, but you're right. There's a lot of problems, too many bosses, too many people trying to manage a process that no one has an idea what reality is. And having that kind of partnership for sure helps. But as always, and as always, you have to have people that actually will leave the camp and go and interact with the people. I know my folks that are anti-coin will not like the hearts and minds stuff, but the bottom line is this: if we don't know what's going on in the villages, it doesn't matter what's going on in the main route, because, all they've got to do is move further out. The aid has to seep off of the main route, get out there. And all too often, Department of State folks just aren't able. They aren't trained to, they aren't capable of doing that. Right. And, really what happens, what I've seen is that the State Department machine, the U.S. aid machine requires so much effort for that local person that even if they are inclined to get out, they simply can't, based on what they have to report up higher and the lack of autonomy. They have just such fantastic restrictions. Our diplomats have, are in many places almost locked down to the embassy, and they can't conduct their jobs as either as diplomats, as development workers, or what have you, alongside the military if they're not allowed to leave. Exactly to your point. And then the second piece is there's just not enough of them. So, one piece one data point that Secretary Gates always harped on was that there were more USAID officers in Vietnam alone than there are now worldwide. And that's just something that we have to take, a hard look at. And that goes back to even kind of the more macro strategic kind of point of, are we prepared as a nation to continue to conduct this type of warfare? My argument is that we really don't have a choice. Nobody wants to. Nobody wants to say that we're going to be engaged in places like Somalia and Yemen and Syria and Afghanistan for the next several decades. But I have argued for years now, there's no effective solution, and turning our back is only going to make the problem worse and allow it to fester. And we've seen that now, sadly, with Iraq and ISIS. Yeah, there's a cost either way. Either you're going to pay to be there, or you're going to pay the cost of not being there. And the cost of not being there, quite frankly, in Pete's opinion, is that the extremists come to America and they blow up Christmas, they blow up the mall, they blow up the things that we don't have to deal with that in our country. Try going to Israel, try going to Baghdad, and try to live a regular life. That's what will happen. That's what will come here. There's no doubt about it.
Well, and the other piece too is we need to look at how we're organized and what type of threats we're going to face in the future. I mean, we, as I mentioned earlier, we still have 30,000 troops in South Korea. We still have almost that many in Japan. We have a large presence in Germany. We still have soldiers actually in the Sinai and in Bosnia. So, to your earlier point of what can we sustain, I think we need to really look at, are we still organized to fight state-on-state conventional warfare, or are we organizing to deal with these unstable countries where extremism, criminal elements, and other bad actors fester to the point that organizations that do want to directly harm the United States or get their hands on WMD can grow and train and get to the point that they're a threat to the homeland.
Well,
and I'm not sure in that macro sense that we can do both. And I think we have to make some hard choices as a nation.
Yeah, we can't do both. And I know in my colonel network, my armor and my artillery officers are shuddering at the thought of not having, not having those capabilities. But the bottom line is this: when you go to NTC, the National Training Center, to practice fighting, if you can't fight militarily, sure, let's do that. We have the world's best military. Maybe we need to not be 5 laps in front of everybody else military and be able to win socially, culturally, using religion. If we can't win in those aspects of the fight, the information fight, good grief, if we spent some time and effort there, we might be a lot better off.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think we're in violent agreement there.
We for sure will be tweeting. Now, do you have a Twitter handle that we can tag you on?
I do. I have, it's MGG Waltz.
Okay. All right.
Mike Golf WALTZ.
Gotcha.
I have the publisher put up a book website. It's michaelgwaltz.com.
And then we also want to remind our listeners, support the Matthew Pacino Foundation, support the Green Beret Foundation, and thank you for coming on the show and for your dedication, your service. We really appreciate you.
Well, no, listen, gentlemen, thank you. No, thank you guys for what you're doing to kind of bring various voices out to the American people. Because, not to get on another discussion, but I don't think our traditional conventional media is doing a great job of it. So thank you for what you're doing.
One of the reasons why I do this, Michael, is you can tell my experience on the ground is significant, and my voice is not. And so one of the things I forced John to do is to have these kind of discussions so that people can hear. Because I'll be darned if I can get a job helping anybody, but I'm just going ahead and rub my mouth and bring other guys that know more than I do and act like I'm a big shot because I have all you smart guys out here talking and telling the truth. And maybe just maybe, the show will help contribute to the louder voice and make a little bit of a difference.
Oh, I think it is. So thanks for what you're doing.
All right, let me close up the show. Warrior, diplomat, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Waltz. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, guys. Have a great day.
You too.
Take care.